On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio across Japan for the first time in history. He announced surrender. And in that moment, across dozens of factories, airfields, and assembly plants scattered throughout Japan and the Pacific, workers simply stopped. Tools were put down. Assembly lines went quiet. Half-built Zero fighters sat exactly where they were, wings partially attached, engines half-installed, cockpits open to the sky. In a matter of hours, the most advanced fighter aircraft Japan had ever produced became scrap metal. But what actually happened to those factories, and to the thousands of Zeros left behind, is a story most people have never heard. To understand it, you have to understand what the Mitsubishi A6M Zero actually was. When it first appeared over China in 1940, Allied pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, and had a range so extraordinary that American commanders initially refused to believe reports coming in from the field. It could fly over 1,500 miles on a single tank of fuel, nearly twice the range of comparable American fighters, and in the early years of the war, it dominated every theater it entered. At Pearl Harbor, at the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies, the Zero was Japan's symbol of air superiority. The entire Japanese Pacific offensive was built around what this aircraft could do. It was built primarily by Mitsubishi, in factories centered around Nagoya, Japan's industrial heartland. Alongside Mitsubishi, Nakajima Aircraft also produced Zeros under license, with additional assembly operations spread across facilities that ranged from purpose-built modern plants to converted civilian manufacturing sites. By the time Japan surrendered, these factories had produced over 10,000 Zeros, more than any other Japanese aircraft of the war. At their peak, Mitsubishi's Nagoya operations were churning out hundreds of aircraft per month, working around the clock under conditions that grew increasingly desperate as American bombing campaigns intensified through 1944 and 1945. And that's where this story gets complicated, because by the time Japan surrendered, most of these factories were already ruins. The American strategic bombing campaign against Japan's aircraft industry had been one of the most sustained and destructive in the entire war. The Nagoya area, home to the core of Japanese aircraft production, was hit repeatedly by B-29 raids starting in late 1944. The Mitsubishi engine plant at Nagoya was struck multiple times, with raids in December 1944 and January 1945 causing damage that took months to partially repair. The airframe plant was bombed so heavily that production had to be dispersed to smaller, harder-to-target facilities, converted schools, warehouses, even underground locations similar to what Germany was simultaneously attempting on the other side of the world. By August 1945, the major centralized factories were already largely destroyed. What American occupation forces found when they arrived wasn't a functioning industrial empire waiting to be seized, it was a patchwork of damaged buildings, dispersed workshops, and scattered equipment, with thousands of incomplete aircraft parked on airfields and in the open, many already cannibalized for parts to keep operational planes flying. Workers had stripped usable components from grounded aircraft to patch together the ones still capable of flight, a practice that became so common in the final months that entire assembly lines existed not to build new aircraft but simply to keep a shrinking fleet barely airworthy. The Zero assembly line that had once symbolized Japanese air power in 1941 was, by 1945, barely a functioning enterprise. But the dispersed production system Japan had built in its final year of war meant that not everything was destroyed. Smaller satellite facilities, some of them underground, some hidden in rural areas away from obvious bombing targets, survived relatively intact. And these sites, along with the aircraft themselves, would become the focus of one of the most intensive technical intelligence operations the United States had ever conducted. Because even in defeat, the Zero still held secrets worth knowing. American engineers who had spent 4 years figuring out how to fight the Zero now had the chance to take one apart and understand exactly why it was so dangerous, and perhaps more importantly, why it had become so vulnerable by the war's end. Understanding the Zero's design philosophy, its manufacturing methods, and the industrial decisions behind it would directly inform American aircraft and later aerospace development for years to come. What they found when they started examining the factories, the blueprints, and the aircraft themselves was both impressive and revealing, a story of extraordinary engineering achievement pushed to its absolute limit, and then past it, in ways that would shape how the United States thought about aircraft design for the next decade. That examination, and the fate of the factories that survived, is where we're going next. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan in late August and September 1945, one of their earliest priorities was securing what remained of Japan's aviation industry. This wasn't simply about preventing Japan from rearming, it was about understanding what Japan had actually built, and extracting whatever knowledge remained before the factories were dismantled, repurposed, or simply left to deteriorate. Technical intelligence teams moved quickly through the Nagoya area and other aviation centers, documenting what survived of Mitsubishi and Nakajima's production facilities. What they found was a picture of an industry that had been pushed far beyond its natural capacity. Japan had entered the war with a sophisticated but relatively small aviation manufacturing base, and the demands of 4 years of intense Pacific combat had stretched it to the breaking point. Production records, engineering drawings, tooling specifications, and performance data were seized and shipped back to the United States for analysis, joining a broader flood of captured technical material flowing in from both Germany and Japan during those chaotic post-war months. The aircraft themselves received particular attention. Across airfields throughout Japan and the wider Pacific, hundreds of Zeros sat abandoned, some intact, some damaged, many in various states of disassembly. American technical teams selected examples for detailed evaluation, shipping several back to the United States for flight testing and engineering analysis. The goal was straightforward: understand this aircraft completely, because understanding it meant understanding what Japan had been able to achieve with limited raw materials, less advanced industrial infrastructure, and engineering choices driven as much by scarcity as by design philosophy. What the analysis revealed was striking. The Zero's extraordinary performance, particularly its range and maneuverability, had been achieved through deliberate, calculated sacrifice. Mitsubishi's chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had stripped weight from virtually every component, eliminating self-sealing fuel tanks, reducing armor protection for the pilot to near zero, and using an unusually lightweight aluminum alloy developed specifically for this aircraft. Every performance advantage the Zero had in 1940 and 1941 came directly from these decisions. And every vulnerability it showed by 1943 and 1944, its tendency to catch fire, its inability to survive damage that American fighters absorbed and flew home from, came from exactly the same source. This was an enormously valuable lesson for American engineers. Not because it revealed some secret Japan had that America lacked, but because it illustrated in concrete, measurable terms the real cost of design trade-offs, information that fed directly into post-war American thinking about combat aircraft design, where survivability and pilot protection became increasingly central rather than optional considerations. As for the factories themselves, their post-war fate was determined largely by a combination of bomb damage, occupation policy, and the extraordinary pragmatism of Japanese industrial companies facing rebuilding from almost nothing. Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities, already heavily damaged, were initially placed under strict occupation controls that prohibited any aviation-related production. The American Occupation Authority, SCAP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, issued directives specifically designed to prevent Japan from rebuilding any military aviation capability, which meant former aircraft factories couldn't simply be restarted for new purposes related to flight. So Mitsubishi did what many large Japanese industrial companies did: it pivoted entirely. In the years immediately following the war, the same Nagoya facilities that had built Zero fighters shifted to producing consumer goods, sewing machines, kitchen equipment, motorcycles, and eventually automobiles. The engineering workforce didn't disappear, it was redirected. The precision manufacturing capability that had produced aircraft components became the foundation for a broader industrial rebuilding effort that would, within 2 decades, help transform Japan into one of the world's leading manufacturing economies. Nakajima Aircraft took a different path, formally dissolving its aviation operations under occupation pressure and reorganizing as Fuji Sangyo, eventually becoming part of what would later be known as Subaru. The connection between a company that built Zero engines during wartime and a car brand sold in showrooms today is one of those strange historical threads that seems almost too unlikely to be true, but is. Not everything was repurposed or rebuilt. Across Japan and the Pacific Islands where the war had been fought, hundreds of Zeros simply sat and rotted, in jungle clearings, on coral airstrips, in shallow coastal waters where they'd been pushed aside or had crash-landed. For decades, these aircraft deteriorated quietly in conditions that were devastating to airframes and engines. The vast majority were gone long before anyone thought to preserve them, consumed by tropical humidity, vegetation, and the simple passage of time. Today, fewer than 10 complete Zeros survive anywhere in the world, a remarkable scarcity for an aircraft produced in such enormous numbers. Most of the survivors were either in the United States for technical evaluation when the war ended, or were found in remote locations decades later and painstakingly restored. Each one represents both a feat of preservation and a reminder of how completely and quickly an entire manufacturing empire can disappear. The Zero factories are gone. Mitsubishi today makes cars, air conditioners, and electronics. Nakajima's descendants build Subarus. The airfields where Zeros once scrambled for altitude are apartment complexes and industrial parks. And in a handful of museums, a small number of surviving aircraft sit behind barriers, as close as most people will ever get to the aircraft that once defined an era of air combat and the factories that built them at the cost of everything Japan had left to give. If this kind of history is what you're here for, subscribe, and next week, we're covering what happened to Japan's secret submarine program, the I-400 class, the largest submarines ever built at the time, and what the US Navy did when they found them.